There are stories that belong to one country, one culture, one moment in time. And then there are stories that belong to everyone. Stories that cross every border and language barrier and cultural divide and land in the hearts of people who have never set foot in the country where the story began, who have no personal stake in its outcome, no family connection to its characters, no particular reason to care, and yet find themselves caring with an intensity that surprises even themselves. The story of the British royal family is one of those stories. It has been unfolding for centuries, and it has been capturing the world's attention in one form or another for as long as anyone alive today can remember. But within that long story, there are chapters so vivid, so deeply human, so full of love and loss and beauty and sorrow that they transcend the merely interesting and become something rarer and more powerful. They become unforgettable. The chapter that captured the world more completely than any other began on a cold February morning in 1981 when a young woman named Diana Spencer stepped out of a car in London wearing a blue suit and a slightly nervous smile, and the press who had gathered outside got their first proper look at the woman who was about to be announced as the future bride of Charles, Prince of Wales. She was 19 years old. She worked as a nursery teacher's assistant. She had grown up near the royal family's Sandringham estate in Norfolk, but had no expectation of ever joining it. She was shy, in the way that some extraordinarily beautiful people are shy, as if their beauty itself creates a kind of shyness, an awareness of being looked at that produces a self-consciousness that takes years to learn to manage. When the reporter asked her about love, she said, of course, and Charles, standing beside her, said, whatever in love means, which the watching world noted with a kind of uneasy amusement that only fully crystallized into something darker much later, when everything that those 4 words contained had been revealed. The engagement ring she wore was a 12-carat oval blue sapphire surrounded by 14 solitaire diamonds. She had chosen it herself from a selection provided by the royal jeweler, which was slightly unconventional and which would prove to be deeply significant decades later when the ring passed to her son William, who slipped it onto another young woman's finger on a mountainside in Kenya. But in 1981, it was simply the most talked about piece of jewelry on earth, and the woman wearing it was simply the most watched person on the planet. And the story that was beginning was described by almost everyone who witnessed it as a fairy tale. July the 29th, 1981, a national holiday in Britain, 600,000 people lining the streets of London to watch the glass coach carry Diana from Clarence House to St. Paul's Cathedral, 750 million people watching on television in 74 countries, Americans setting alarm clocks for 5 in the morning to watch the broadcast live, the largest television audience ever assembled for a royal event at a time when the world had never had quite so many screens on which to watch something together, and the shared experience of watching was still new enough to feel extraordinary. Diana arrived at the cathedral steps, and the world got its first proper view of the dress. It was ivory silk taffeta with a 25-foot train designed by David and Elizabeth Emanuel, and it emerged from the glass coach in the particular way that a dress like that must emerge, slowly and with enormous care, attendants positioned at exactly the right angles to ensure that every inch of it landed perfectly. The train swept down the cathedral steps like a slow tide. The sleeves were extravagantly puffed. The antique lace that bordered the neckline had been chosen to incorporate a tiny personal detail, a blue ribbon, the something blue of the old tradition, sewn into the waistband where no camera could see it. The dress was impractical, enormous, slightly overwhelming, and utterly magnificent. It was a dress that told the world exactly what kind of story this was supposed to be. Inside the cathedral, 3,500 guests watched Diana walk the distance of the aisle, which at St. Paul's is longer and more dramatic than at Westminster Abbey, partly why the venue had been chosen. Charles waited at the altar in his naval commander's uniform, and Diana walked toward him, and the world watched, and nobody who was watching would ever quite forget it. She was nervous, and she was radiant, and she was 20 years old, and she was stepping into the most public role in the most watched institution in the world. And in that moment, the full weight of what that meant had not yet landed on her, and the joy on her face was genuine, and the joy of the watching world in response to it was genuine. And it was one of the most beautiful things mass television had ever put in front of people. At the altar, she made a small, human mistake. She said his names in the wrong order. Philip Charles Arthur George, she said, instead of Charles Philip Arthur George. He laughed. The watching world laughed. It was the kind of mistake that made her feel reachable, real. Not a marble princess, but a nervous young woman doing something almost incomprehensibly large and managing it with grace and charm, and the occasional understandable stumble. She said she would love him and comfort him, honor and keep him. She did not say she would obey. That word had been removed from the vows at the couple's request, which was noted and debated and which, in retrospect, carries its own complicated meaning. The kiss on the balcony at Buckingham Palace afterward has been replicated and referenced and reproduced so many times that it has become almost abstract, an image that exists outside of time, outside of the specific people who performed it, a symbol of something that the word romance only partially captures. Charles and Diana kissed once, briefly, and then the crowd below went mad, and they kissed again, and the crowd went mad again. And somewhere in that moment, the story stopped being about two particular people and became something much bigger. It became about the idea of love made visible, about the fairy tale made real, about the ancient promise that one day, if you were lucky, something beautiful would come. The years that followed were years in which the world continued to watch, but what they were watching slowly changed. Diana had two sons, William in 1982 and Harry in 1984. She learned the protocols of royal life and she pushed against them. She shook the hands of AIDS patients in 1987 when the panic around AIDS was at its height and the homophobic mythology around it was at its most toxic. And she did it without gloves because she understood that the gesture needed to be complete to have the impact she wanted it to have. She visited the homeless and the sick and the elderly and the unloved, not with the polite distance that royal visits often involved, but with a physical closeness, a genuine touch, a quality of attention that people felt rather than just saw. She sat on hospital beds. She crouched to be at eye level with children in wheelchairs. She held the hands of people who were dying. She brought her sons to homeless shelters so they would understand from the beginning that the world they would inherit contained suffering that they had a responsibility to acknowledge and address. She also suffered. The marriage was in difficulty from early on. That much became increasingly clear to the watching world as the decade wore on, and the fairy tale calcified into something harder and more painful. Charles had never stopped loving Camilla Parker Bowles. Diana had known this and married him anyway, hoping perhaps that the love she felt would be enough, that the public love at least would sustain something. It wasn't enough. The incompatibility between them was fundamental, a clash of temperament and expectation and emotional need that no amount of shared duty could bridge. By the early 1990s, the marriage was over in everything but name, and the war for public sympathy that followed was waged with a ferocity and a sophistication that shocked observers who had assumed the royal family operated above such things. The photograph of Diana sitting alone in front of the Taj Mahal in 1992 is one of the most deliberate and devastating images in royal history. Charles had promised years earlier to bring her there. They were finally in India together. He declined to accompany her to the site. She went alone, arranged her attendants and companions out of the shot, and sat before the world's most famous monument to romantic love in a posture of complete and visible solitude. The image was on the front page of every tabloid in Britain and every newspaper in the world within hours. Nobody needed a caption. The story wrote itself. In 1992, the separation was officially announced. In 1995, Diana sat down for a BBC Panorama interview that became the most watched television interview in British history. Sitting in a darkened room in a black turtleneck, her eyes rimmed with kohl that seemed to deepen the vulnerability her expression was already projecting, she spoke about the marriage and the affairs, and the mental health struggles and the bulimia and the suicidal feelings and the sense of being trapped inside an institution that neither understood nor valued her. She said, "There were 3 of us in the marriage, so it was a bit crowded." She said she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. She said she hoped whatever she went through, she would be able to help others. She said it with such complete and heartbreaking sincerity that the viewing public, all 15 million of them in Britain alone, felt something that transcended the normal relationship between audience and public figure. They felt known by her. They felt that she was speaking not just about her own experience, but about every experience of isolation and inadequacy, and the particular loneliness of being surrounded by people who should understand and finding that they don't. The divorce was finalized in August 1996. Diana lost the HRH. She retained the title Princess of Wales. She continued her work, which had never really been about the title and had always been about the work. She walked through an Angolan minefield in January 1997 in jeans and a protective vest. Photographs of her flanked by explosives and small children captured by photographers who understood that the image of a princess in a minefield was something that would move the world in ways that a press release about landmine casualties could never achieve. 3 months after her visit, 122 countries signed the Anti-Personnel Mine Ban Treaty. The direct causal connection between her presence and that outcome is debated, but the correlation is impossible to ignore. The summer of 1997 was supposed to be a new beginning. She had survived the marriage and the divorce and the stripping of her royal status, and she was emerging into something that people who knew her described as a new confidence, a new clarity about who she was and what she wanted. She was 36, she had her boys, she had her causes, she had the attention of the world, and she was learning, slowly and painfully, how to use it on her own terms rather than the institution's. On the 31st of August 1997, she died in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris. She was being pursued by photographers. She was 36 years old. The days that followed her death are among the most extraordinary in modern British history. The grief that erupted across Britain was unlike anything the country had experienced before. People arrived outside Kensington Palace in the dark, carrying flowers they had driven through the night to bring, and the flowers piled up until they covered the grass in a carpet so vast that the scent of them could be detected from hundreds of meters away. The cards attached to them were written in the language of personal loss, not celebrity mourning. People wrote as if they had known her, as if a friend had gone, as if someone who had understood them had left, and the world was lonelier now. The rest of that story, the silence from Balmoral, the absent flag, the Queen's eventual broadcast, the bow at the coffin, has already been told in these scripts. But what it led to in the long run is worth dwelling on. Diana's death did not end her story. In a sense, it transformed her story into something that neither she nor anyone around her could have predicted or controlled, which is to say, it turned her into a myth. Myths are not lies. They are stories that carry truths too large for ordinary narration. The myth of Diana, the people's princess, the woman who broke the fourth wall between royalty and humanity, who touched the untouchable and named the unnameable and paid for it with the full weight of the press machine that she had understood and used and been destroyed by. That myth has only grown in the nearly 3 decades since her death. It lives in the ring her son William placed on Kate Middleton's finger. It lives in the earrings Kate wore at Royal Ascot just weeks ago, diamonds that had belonged to Diana, chosen deliberately, worn in plain sight, a quiet conversation across time between two women who never met. It lives in Archie and Lilibet, Diana's grandchildren growing up in California, who will inherit a story they didn't ask for and will have to decide for themselves what to do with it. But the royal story that captured the world is not only Diana's story, although her chapter is its beating heart. The full story is larger and longer and stranger than any single life it contains. It is the story of an institution that has endured for 1,000 years by finding, at every moment of crisis, some way to remain relevant to the people it serves. It is the story of a family that lives its most private moments in total public view, that grieves on television and falls in love on balconies and falls out and reconciles and fails and tries again, always in front of an audience of billions who are watching partly out of fascination and partly out of something that feels uncomfortably like love. The coronation of Elizabeth II in 1953 was the first to be televised, watched by 27 million people on small black and white sets in living rooms, where neighbors crowded together because not every family had a television yet. The images of the young queen being crowned in Westminster Abbey, the ancient words of the ceremony, the heaviness of the crown being lowered onto the head of a 25-year-old woman who had not expected to be queen, and who would go on to carry the role with extraordinary dignity for 70 years. Those images fixed themselves in the consciousness of a generation and created a relationship between the monarchy and the television audience that would define everything that came after. Because that is what the royal story fundamentally is. It is a relationship, not between a family and a nation, exactly, though it is that too, but between a story and the people who watch it. The story offers continuity in a world that is constantly changing. It offers ceremony and ritual at a time when ceremony and ritual have largely been stripped from public life. It offers the ancient comfort of watching a family navigate the same fundamental things that every family navigates: love and loss and illness and conflict and reconciliation and the handing down of responsibility from one generation to the next, but doing so on a scale and in a context that transforms the ordinary into the extraordinary. The wedding of William and Kate in April 2011 drew an estimated 2 billion viewers. 2 billion, more than a quarter of the population of the entire Earth. They gathered around screens in offices and living rooms and public squares in cities on every continent, and they watched a young couple exchange vows in Westminster Abbey, and they felt something. Not all of them could have said precisely what they felt, but something in that ceremony, in the ancient building and the formal language and the enormous sense of accumulated history pressing down on two young people who were simply at the core of it, in love and trying to say so in front of everyone, touched something deep and universal: the hunger for ceremony, the need for shared experience, the desire to witness something beautiful and feel, even briefly, connected to the rest of humanity by having witnessed it together. 25 years after Diana's funeral, the world gathered again in September 2022 when Queen Elizabeth died at 96 at Balmoral. The queue to file past her coffin in Westminster Hall stretched for 4.5 miles, and the waiting time at its peak was 24 hours. People from every country, every background, every age, stood in the cold for the better part of a day for the chance to spend 30 seconds walking past a coffin. Outside, the flowers piled up as they had in 1997, and the cards again were written in the language of personal loss. One card, read on television by a journalist who was visibly moved, said simply, "Thank you for always being there." That card explains everything. Thank you for always being there. In a world where everything seems impermanent, where institutions crumble and certainties dissolve, and the ground keeps shifting under everyone's feet, the British royal family has provided, for generation after generation, the consolation of presence. They are always there. The ceremony continues. The flag flies. The monarch appears on the balcony. And whether you believe in the institution or think it should be abolished, whether you find the whole spectacle irresistible or quietly absurd, the fact of its persistence, the sheer determined continuity of it, commands a kind of respect. The royal story that captured the world is still being written. It is being written right now in a hospital in London where King Charles continues his recovery from cancer with the determination and the quiet courage that the best of his family have always brought to impossible circumstances. It is being written in a house in Windsor where Kate sits with her children and her husband, and the particular peace that people sometimes find on the other side of something that almost broke them. It is being written in California, where Harry and Meghan are packing bags for a trip to England that carries more weight than any holiday should, and where two small children named Archie and Lilibet are preparing to visit a country they were born into but have barely seen, to meet family members they know mostly through screens, to begin perhaps the long process of knitting back together something that was torn. And it is being written in the continued existence of a sapphire ring on Kate's finger, in the pearl bracelet from Diana's collection that Kate chose for royal ascot, in the earrings passed down through generations and worn today by a woman who never met the woman they once belonged to, but who carries her forward nonetheless. Because that is what royal stories do. They carry people forward. They refuse to let the important things be forgotten. They insist, in the face of every kind of change and loss and time, that what has been loved continues to matter. The world has been watching this story for a very long time. It shows no sign of looking away.